Your nervous system has 4 responses to danger. For almost 100 years, we only knew about 3. The 4th one doesn't look like fear. It looks like kindness. It looks like being easy to work with, low maintenance, always warm. Like the particular quality of someone who never makes things difficult for anyone else. And if you have spent your life being described that way, what comes next may be one of the more disorienting things you hear tonight. Take a slow breath. Come settle in the dark for a moment. We have time here, and nothing needs to be rushed. What you're about to hear has a name: the Fawn response. It is the 4th trauma response, and the one that, for nearly a century, wasn't on the map at all. It describes the survival strategy of a nervous system that learned to manage threat not by fighting, not by fleeing, not by going still, but by reaching toward the danger, by reading it, by making itself useful to it, by performing, with extraordinary precision, the face of someone who has no needs and no edges and nothing that could possibly cause a problem. There is a finding I want to hold until the second half, something from research into the autonomic nervous system that turns the common understanding of this response completely around. It concerns what is actually happening inside the body of the person who appears most agreeable, most calm, most at ease, and it is not what most people expect. And underneath all of it is a question that many people living inside this pattern have never quite let themselves sit with. If what the world called your warmth was actually your fear, if your generosity was, at least in part, a nervous system trying to neutralize a threat, then who are you underneath it? That question can wait, but it won't stay quiet for long. To understand where you are, it helps to understand how incomplete the map was. For most of human history, and well into the 20th century, the science of how bodies respond to threat rested on a model developed at Harvard. In 1915, physiologist Walter Bradford Cannon published work describing what he called the fight-or-flight response, the surge of adrenaline and cortisol that floods the system when danger is perceived, the heart rate climbing, blood rushing to the large muscle groups, the organism mobilizing to either confront the threat or run from it. Cannon's model was elegant, and it was adopted nearly everywhere. For decades, fight or flight was the foundational language of how we understood stress. And then, gradually, anomalies began to accumulate. In certain animals, and in certain humans, faced with inescapable threat, neither option engaged. No fighting, no fleeing. A kind of suspended stillness instead. By the mid-20th century, researchers had begun to recognize a third response: freeze. The body going immobile when both fight and flight have been assessed and found impossible. An ancient strategy reaching back to reptiles that makes an organism appear dead, or at least unremarkable, to whatever is bearing down on it. So the model grew from 2 responses to 3: fight, flight, freeze. And for most of the 20th century, that was considered the complete picture. It wasn't. There was a 4th response, one that didn't look like fear at all, one that looked like kindness. You already know, intuitively, what the Fawn response looks like. You may have lived inside it for so long that you stopped recognizing it as a response at all. You thought it was just who you were. Pete Walker is a psychotherapist who specializes in complex trauma. He spent decades working with clients who had survived prolonged childhood abuse and neglect. Not the single catastrophic event that most people picture when they hear the word trauma, but the slow accumulation of living in a household where love was unpredictable, where the person who was supposed to be safe was innocent, also the person who was dangerous, where the atmosphere shifted without warning, and reading it accurately meant survival. In his 2013 book, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving, Walker articulated what he called the 4 F's of trauma response: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Fawn, in Walker's framework, describes what happens when a child cannot fight. Because the threat is the caregiver, and the caregiver is also necessary for survival. Cannot flee, because there is nowhere to go. Cannot freeze indefinitely, because the world keeps demanding responses. And so the nervous system finds a fourth option. It reaches toward the source of danger. It reads the danger. It mirrors it. It appeases it. It becomes, in the fullest sense, useful to it. Walker's own description is worth sitting with. Fawn types, he wrote, seek safety by merging with the wishes, needs, and demands of others. They act as if they unconsciously believe that the price of admission to any relationship is the forfeiture of all their needs, rights, preferences, and boundaries. This was not softness. This was not kindness. This was architecture. The architecture of a nervous system that had learned, very early, that its own feelings were dangerous, and that the safest way to exist was to have as few of them as possible, or at least to let none of them show. Here's the part of this that most people get backwards. Fawning is often described as the gentlest of the 4 trauma responses, the least disruptive, the one that looks most like cooperating with the world, and so it tends to be treated as less serious, less urgent, less worthy of the attention given to the other 3. But that framing misses something essential. Fawning doesn't protect a person from their own pain. It relocates it inward, where it teaches the nervous system a lesson that can take decades to unlearn, that the self is not safe to inhabit. Walker's work emerged within a broader conversation about what trauma researchers had begun calling complex PTSD, a condition distinct from the single event PTSD framework, characterized by prolonged and repeated relational trauma, particularly the kind that occurs inside the relationships that were supposed to provide safety. Dr. Judith Herman's foundational 1992 work, Trauma and Recovery, had already begun to map what this kind of sustained harm does to the developing psyche. Walker gave the Fawn response its name, and by naming it, he gave thousands of people a mirror in which, for the first time, they could actually see themselves. Many of them, looking into it, met someone they hadn't been introduced to yet. So, what does it actually look like? In you, if this is your experience. In your daily life, if this response has been running quietly in the background. It looks like saying yes before the question is finished. It looks like reading a room before entering it. Scanning for barometric pressure, for the particular weight in someone's voice that means the atmosphere is about to shift. It looks like apologizing, reflexively, for things that were not your fault. It looks like feeling a particular alarm in your stomach when someone near you is unhappy, even when their unhappiness has nothing to do with you. It looks like not knowing, when someone asks what you want for dinner, what you actually want. Because for a very long time, what you wanted was irrelevant to your safety. And so your preferences quietly withdrew, and kept withdrawing, until they became genuinely hard to locate. It looks like being praised for being easy, warm, thoughtful, always considering others, and feeling somewhere underneath the praise, something that doesn't quite feel like pride, more like a hollow in the chest where something else was supposed to be. You may recognize yourself here. If you do, take a breath. That recognition is not condemnation. It is the beginning of something else. Psychologist Dr. Ariel Schwartz, who has written extensively on complex PTSD, describes the Fawn response as involving a disconnection from your own bodily sensations, going numb, losing access to your own needs, in order to stay hyper-attuned to someone else's. The child who learns to monitor a parent's emotional state is not doing so freely. They are doing so because their safety, in some fundamental way, depends on the reading being accurate. And here is something the research gives us that should give you pause. What your brain was doing in those moments was not developing empathy. It was calibrating a threat detection system. The Fawn response co-opts the social engagement circuitry of the nervous system and repurposes it, not for genuine connection, but for survival monitoring. What the world later calls reading the room, emotional intelligence, being so tuned in to other people, may have begun as something else entirely. The skill was real. The conditions under which it was learned were not acceptable. Now comes the part that needs to be said clearly. Fawning doesn't develop only in isolated households. It develops inside a cultural context. And that cultural context does something that, once you see it, is difficult to unsee. It takes the behaviors produced by a trauma response and systematically rewards them. The child who is frightened into compliance becomes the adult who is described as warm, agreeable, selfless, such a team player, someone who's just so easy to be around. A 2020 study published in the Journal of Personality and Individual Differences found that trauma shapes personality traits, including agreeableness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism, suggesting that what the world praises as someone's essential character may actually be, at least in part, the shape that chronic fear left behind. The research shows correlation rather than a simple causal chain, and individual variation matters enormously. But the implication remains. What has been called personality may, in some cases, be a survival strategy that calcified, and this is not distributed equally. Research and clinical observation consistently point toward fawning being disproportionately reinforced in women and in marginalized communities. Groups for whom the consequences of fight or flight are higher, for whom assertiveness gets labeled as aggression, for whom being difficult carries real and concrete costs. For women especially, the behaviors that fawning produces, warmth, agreeableness, emotional labor, the constant smoothing of conflict, are not merely tolerated. They are expected, required. They become the price of acceptability, which means that the very culture that would need to help someone recognize and heal the fawn response is simultaneously rewarding it as a virtue and punishing its absence. The fawn response is the trauma survival pattern most easily mistaken for kindness. And for the person living inside it, that mistaken identity can be one of the most disorienting parts of the whole experience. Because if what you have been called kind for is actually fear, if your generosity is partially a nervous system trying to neutralize a threat, then the question that surfaces is one of the most unsettling a person can sit with. Who am I if this wasn't really me? Hold that. We'll come back to it. There is something I want to name before we go further. Something about what years of this does to the body, and why the physical symptoms many fawners carry without explanation are not coincidences. We will get there. But first, we need to understand what is actually happening inside the nervous system during fawning, because it is not what most people assume. You have already felt the physical sensation of this, if this is your experience. The particular tightening in your chest before you agree to something you didn't want to agree to. The held breath before an apology that wasn't yours to give. The way your shoulders settle into a shape that makes you smaller before you even know you've done it. This is the body, not the mind trying to be polite. The body running a program. To understand what that program actually is, we need to spend a moment with a framework developed by neuroscientist Stephen Porges in 1994, what he called polyvagal theory. It is worth noting that while polyvagal theory has been widely adopted in trauma-informed therapy and has generated significant clinical insight, aspects of its underlying neuroanatomy remain debated among researchers. What follows draws on its therapeutic framework rather than treating it as established neuroscientific consensus. In Porges's model, the autonomic nervous system is organized into 3 hierarchical circuits, each corresponding to a different period in vertebrate evolution. The oldest circuit, the dorsal vagal system, governs the most primitive shutdown responses: collapse, freeze, going limp under inescapable threat. The middle circuit, the sympathetic nervous system, governs fight and flight. And the newest circuit, present only in mammals, the ventral vagal complex, governs something else entirely: social engagement, the ability to modulate vocal tone, to make facial expressions that communicate safety, to reach toward another being and signal, without words, "I mean you no harm." In Porges's framework, this social engagement system is what allows genuine connection. But as Porges and Seth Porges describe in Our Polyvagal World, it is also what the nervous system draws upon during appeasement and fawning, the attempt to navigate from danger to safety, not by fighting, fleeing, or collapsing, but by using the circuitry of social warmth to neutralize the threat. And here is what that actually means for your body. When you are in a fawn response, you are not at ease. What appears to the outside world as calm, cooperativeness, warmth, is, at the physiological level, a complex and effortful performance. The nervous system must simultaneously suppress the mobilization toward fight or flight that threat normally triggers, while activating the social engagement circuitry to produce the facial expressions, the vocal softness, the attentive openness that says, "I am safe to be around. I am not a threat. Please don't hurt me." Two competing systems, running simultaneously. It is not rest. There is something about what the nervous system is actually doing during fawning, what the physiology looks like from the inside, that almost no one who studies trauma responses predicted. And here's the finding that turns everything before it around. For decades, the fawn response, when it was recognized at all, was treated as the easiest of the 4 trauma responses to carry, the most adaptive, the least physiologically costly. After all, the person isn't fighting, isn't fleeing, isn't dissociating. They are functioning. By almost every social metric, they are doing well. But the research into what polyvagal theorists describe as hybrid states, states requiring multiple competing neural circuits to activate simultaneously, suggests something different about the long-term cost. Take a breath. Let that sit for a moment. What it means is this: the fawn response is not a low-energy state. It is a high-energy performance conducted under conditions of chronic threat. It requires the nervous system to override its own most immediate protective impulse, the mobilization toward fight or flight, while simultaneously producing the behaviors that make you appear harmless, cooperative, easy, every time, in every room, in every relationship that might carry any trace of the original danger. The smile produced in a moment of internal alarm is not evidence of calm. It is evidence of extraordinary nervous system management. This reframes everything we have covered so far. The child, who learned to take care of a caregiver's emotional state, was not simply being sweet. Their nervous system was managing something physiologically complex, neutralizing its own threat response in real time in order to produce the behaviors that might keep them safe. The adult who always finds a way to agree, who can sense what a room needs and supply it, who has never quite learned to say no, is not weak. Their nervous system has been trained to a precision that most people cannot access. The kindness was never the lie. The fear was just hidden behind it. The body does not forget what the mind was never allowed to process. Here is what that means for you. Specifically, if you recognize yourself in any of this. You have read a text and known exactly what you wanted to say, and typed something different, not because you didn't know your own mind, but because somewhere in your nervous system, before the thought was even conscious, a small alarm had already completed its calculation. The real response might not be safe. The real response might cost something. The real response might make this person uncomfortable. And when people are uncomfortable, something bad tends to follow. So you smoothed it. You softened it. You made it easier for them to receive. This is a body that learned that its own truth was a liability. And when a body believes that for years or decades, The physiological cost accumulates in ways that are not always immediately visible. The HPA axis, which governs the body's stress hormone response through the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal glands, stays in a state of low-grade chronic activation. Cortisol, meant to be deployed briefly in response to acute threat and then cleared, flows continuously at levels the system was not designed to sustain indefinitely. Robert Sapolsky's extensive research on chronic stress physiology, particularly his work on how sustained stress affects immune function, has described in detail how this kind of low-level, unresolved activation can deplete the body over time, disrupting sleep architecture and creating systemic inflammation. Research has found correlations between prolonged, unresolved stress responses and higher rates of autoimmune conditions, migraines, and chronic digestive disorders in trauma survivors. Though disentangling the specific contribution of any single response pattern from the broader landscape of trauma's effects is an ongoing area of research. What is clear is this: the anger that was never permitted to exist outwardly does not disappear. The grief that couldn't be expressed does not simply resolve. They go somewhere. The body, as Bessel van der Kolk's clinical work has long argued, holds what the conscious mind was never given permission to process, and holds it at a cost. For the fawner specifically, this disconnection from the body's own sensations, the numbness, the going quiet inside, can become so complete that you may genuinely not know when you are hungry, not recognize when you are exhausted. Find that when someone asks how you feel, there is a pause that goes on slightly longer than it should, because the internal world became very quiet a long time ago, and relearning to hear it is a process that takes time. There can be deep loneliness inside a life that looks, from the outside, like it's full of connection. Because connection, for someone with a long-practiced fawn response, has often meant disappearing into another person's needs rather than arriving as yourself. And the self, in order to do that reliably, had to be kept at a careful distance, even from you. There is something worth sitting with here, a finding about what this pattern produces in the people who carry it, especially across years of reinforcement. A 2020 study found that trauma shapes agreeableness as a personality trait, not just behavior. Trait, which means you may have been walking around your entire adult life being praised for something that was written into you by an environment that was not safe, and praised in a way that made it harder, not easier, to question it. That is not a small thing. Recovery from the fawn response does not mean becoming a different person. It does not mean becoming harder, or less caring, or suddenly indifferent to the people around you. It means beginning to notice the difference between a yes that comes from wanting and a yes that comes from bracing, between generosity that is freely given and generosity that is compelled, between choosing to be warm and having warmth be the only option your nervous system knows how to produce. The research on treatment for complex PTSD, which includes the fawn response, consistently points toward approaches that work not only at the level of cognition, but at the level of the body itself. Because fawning is not a thought pattern that can simply be reasoned away. It is a nervous system, adaptation, laid down before you had language to describe it, running faster than conscious thought. As van der Kolk's clinical work has long emphasized, we cannot think our way out of a physiological response that predates our ability to think. The body requires a different kind of engagement. EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing has shown consistent effectiveness in treating trauma-related responses, including the fawn pattern, in multiple randomized trials. It works by allowing the nervous system to reprocess the original threat memories that taught the body its calculus. Through EMDR, the brain does not forget what happened, but it learns a different meaning, that safety no longer requires the forfeiture of the self. Internal family systems therapy, developed by Richard Schwartz in the 1990s, offers another entry point, and one particularly well-suited to the fawn response, because it begins by acknowledging the fawning part of you not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a part that learned its job under impossible circumstances. The part of you that agrees before the question is finished, that apologizes before it has done anything wrong. That part was trying to keep you alive. It deserves to be understood before it is asked to change. Somatic approaches, including somatic experiencing, developed by Peter Levine, work at the level of sensation, helping the nervous system notice and complete the defensive responses that were suppressed, one breath at a time. Learning to feel the tightening in your chest before the automatic yes. The held breath before the apology that isn't yours. These sensations are information. They are your body trying to communicate something it was never allowed to say out loud. And here's the repersonalization that none of these therapeutic frameworks will say as directly as it needs to be said. If you have spent years being called warm, agreeable, easy, and felt, underneath those words, something hollow, that hollow is not evidence that you are broken. It is evidence that something was asked of you that should not have been asked. You learned to survive by performing a version of yourself that the environment required. You were extraordinarily good at it. The nervous system did its job. The question of who you are underneath it is not a threat. It is the most interesting question available to you. Neuroplasticity research tells us that the nervous system can learn new patterns at any age. The brain's capacity for new relational learning does not close. What was conditioned can, with the right conditions and enough time, be reconditioned. Not by force, but by repeated, gentle, honest experience of a different kind of safety. Not the safety that comes from making everyone else comfortable. The safety that comes from being willing to let them be a little uncomfortable. Not the approval that comes from having no needs. The belonging that comes from being actually known. You are allowed to take up space, not because you earned it, not because you were agreeable enough, useful enough, easy enough to deserve it, because you are here. You are reading a text. You know what you want to say. You can feel it. The words forming somewhere underneath the place where you usually edit yourself, where the calculation usually begins. For a moment, the old pattern moves. The quiet internal audit. What's safe here? What might cost something? What response will keep everything manageable? And then something else. Not loudness, not force. Just a kind of settling. The way a river finds its own level when the pressure upstream has finally released. You type what you actually mean. The nervous system will not rewrite itself in a single night. There will be other texts, other rooms, other moments where the pattern surfaces faster than thought, older than language. This is not a destination you arrive at and stay. But there is also this. The difference between a person who knows they are fawning and a person who does not is not small. The moment of recognition, however quiet, however late, is the first time the pattern has ever been observed rather than inhabited, and what can be observed and eventually be changed. The fawn response was not a flaw in your character. It was the price of admission to an environment that should have been safe and wasn't. It was the most intelligent adaptation available to a nervous system working under conditions no one should have asked it to work under. You don't have to be grateful for it, but you can stop being ashamed of it. Who you are underneath it is someone who has been waiting, very patiently, for exactly the kind of quiet you have right now. If this named something that has been living in you unnamed, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it too. And if you'd like to keep going deeper into the science of the mind in this kind of depth, a like and a subscribe. Help this channel find the people who are searching for it at midnight when these things finally feel safe to think about. Sleep well. You did something worth doing tonight, just by listening.